All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the director of the Statewide Training Initiative with Florida Legal Services. We're excited to have you join us here today for exploring the Eviction Lab, using data to address housing instability. Before I introduce our speakers, I do want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This training is being recorded, so if you registered, you're going to receive a link to the recording from Zoom within 24 hours. You will also receive a copy of the slides and other materials. I'm going to drop my email eventually into the chat just in case you need anything, just let me know. The training was approved by the Florida Bar for 1 General CLE and zero point 0.5 Technology CLE Credits. I will announce the CLE code towards the end of the presentation, and I will also drop it into the chat. It will also be included in the email that will go out from Zoom. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. If you're having any issues with accessibility or the captions, you can reach out to me directly. This training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar. So if you're not familiar with that section or PILS, I'm going to drop that link into the chat so you can learn more about PILS and its membership benefits. And final piece of housekeeping announcements, questions and answers. Feel free to use the Q&A feature that we have on Zoom. You can drop your questions there. You can even ask questions anonymously. And if the question is related to what our speakers are presenting on, we'll do our best to address the question at that moment. Otherwise, we'll try our best to address questions towards the end. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Juan Pablo Garnham. Juan Pablo is a Chilean journalist interested in cities, public policy, and immigrant communities. In his previous work as the urban affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune, Juan Pablo reported on the main challenges of Texas' largest metro areas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, and Dallas-Fort Worth, where he is based. Juan Pablo has also worked as a senior producer for the podcast In the Thick, editor of City Lab Latino, and City Hall reporter for El Diario in New York. In Chile, he wrote for some of the country's most important magazines and newspapers. Juan Pablo brings his expertise as a bilingual and multimedia journalist to his position as the audience and community engagement editor for the Eviction Lab. Our other speaker is Camila Vallejo. Camila is a bilingual communications specialist for the Eviction Lab. She's interested in eviction diversion measures, who's harmed by evictions and tenant organizing. Prior to joining the lab, Camila was the housing reporter for the Connecticut Public through Report for America, a national service program that places journalists in local newsrooms to dive into undercovered issues. Her work has been featured in NPR's Morning Edition, PRX's The World, NPR's Here and Now, and more. She graduated from the University of Connecticut with a bachelor's in journalism and communications. So without further ado, I'm pleased to pass it over to our speakers. Juan and Camila, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jorge, for that introduction. I guess, yeah, there's not much more else to mention about the both of us, but I think I will note that our contact information is here on the bottom left. If you have any questions whatsoever after this presentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are always happy to, go through our tools or have any other conversations about this issue. So today we'll be talking about our organization, the Eviction Lab, and how you can use our data and research to not only understand evictions, but also address housing instability. So again, we are a housing research center out of Princeton University that helps journalists, policymakers, legal professionals like yourself, and the general public understand evictions, everything from the causes to the geographical distribution and the consequences. And we were the first organization to create a comprehensive database of how many evictions were happening in the US. So thanks to that, in a typical year, we know that landlords file 3.6 million eviction cases nationwide. And this project was really born out of a need to understand something that was happening in the shadows. The lab was founded in 2017, shortly after our founder wrote Evicted, which is a story about the process both from the tenant and the landlord perspective. And while he was following the stories in Milwaukee, he wanted to understand how many other Americans were living this tale, but he faced several obstacles. The problem was and still is that the federal government doesn't require local courts to track this data. If we don't know the span of this issue, how can we potentially solve it? And this lack of data transparency leaves us with a lot of missing pieces and unanswered questions, which differ state to state and cities to cities. As you may know, local courts are really left to decide how they want to track this information. But thankfully, our work has helped change that. Now, why should you care about evictions? There's a lot of reasons why we think you should care about evictions, but there's one specific story from the Tampa Bay Times that really highlights this issue and the impact. So Richard Rodriguez moved to Florida and was evicted just a year later because his rent nearly doubled. The eviction sent him into a spiral of job insecurity and living paycheck to pay for a motel for him and his family. And this was his life for 4 years. He described the situation as being the working poor was like trying to climb out of a hole that wouldn't stop sinking. The reality is that eviction is not just a condition of poverty, but it has a domino effect that can actually throw an individual into poverty. We know that having a safe and affordable home is the foundation of human flourishing. Without a home like that, it can impact your health, access to education, the kind of jobs that you can get, and the community that you're able to create. And unfortunately, as a lot of you may know, that this process, often called the summary process, can happen incredibly fast. And this timeline differs state to state and city to city. This issue is also not as prominent in other countries. For example, evictions in the US are nearly double what they are in Canada. But thankfully, there is a bright side. We know that there are solutions to the system. So now I'll talk a little bit about our recent research and the highlights we think are worth noting. So shortly after our founding, we learned that nearly 3 million renting households were threatened with eviction in an average year. This was thanks to information we had on leaseholders, but we had no clue who was actually living in these homes. But thanks to a recent collaboration we did with the census, we now know that more than 7 million renters experience an eviction filing each year, and that includes nearly 3 million children. We also know that evictions disproportionately impact renters of color, specifically Black renters. Less than 1 in every 5 renters in America is Black, but over half of all eviction filings are against Black renters. And as you can see in this graph, they disproportionately impact Black children. Thanks to this research, we also were able to understand how evictions impacted children under 18, how many of them were being filed against and evicted in each state. These are the top 11 states. And as you can see, Florida ranks 7th, with about 154,000 children threatened with eviction each year. Thanks to that collaboration with the census, we also were able to look at the health impact of not just evictions, but how much you're paying for your housing. So we found that soaring rent prices aren't just hurting wallets, they're actually shortening lifespans. We found people who spent more than 50% of their income were 9% more likely to die in the next 20 years, simply being threatened with an eviction. So having an eviction filing was associated with a 19% increase in mortality, and having an eviction judgment was associated with a 40% increase in the risk of death. We also wanted to understand how the location or where your home is impacts your risk of an eviction. So we looked, for example, at this 3 different regions, and we found that, in fact, where you live does heighten your risk. So we looked at suburbs, we looked at 74 of the largest metros in the US, and while in the year 2000, evictions were more common in the cities, by 2016, evictions were nearly as frequent in the suburbs as they were in cities. We also looked at rural areas, and while we know that it is cheaper to live there, wages are a lot lower, resulting in more than 200,000 rural evictions each year. The annual eviction filing rate in rural communities is 4.3%, which means that about 4 renting households are threatened with an eviction per 100 renting households. And while this number is lower than the national average and what we see in cities, it's still higher than what we observed in higher income areas. And then similar to urban trends, we also know that Black renters are, again, disproportionately impacted in rural evictions. Eviction filing rate was 4 times higher for Black households than they were for white rural households. We've also studied the impact of evictions on communities that are touched by commodity booms. We specifically looked at North Dakota and fracking, but we think this is a warning sign for any community in any location that might be considering new industries In North Dakota, we specifically found that as oil production increased, so did eviction filings, and they harmed people who had a tie to the community prior to the commodity boom even arriving in the town. So through this different research, again, we know that the region in which you live in does impact your risk. And the danger really is that unlike cities, evictions in suburbs, rural, and commodity boom locations might leave tenants fighting off an eviction with little to no help, for example, from legal aid or other community organizations. So now I'll hand it off to Juan Pablo to talk a little bit about our tools that we hope are helpful in Florida.
Thank you so much, Camila. I really appreciate this opportunity, especially I lived in Florida for a while, so it's really nice to be talking to you all. So Camila just explained some highlights of some of the research that we've done. There's a lot more, and you can browse our research page in evictionlab.org, and you can find even more information. But now I'm gonna go into like tools that are really practical, useful, that we've like worked a lot on designing them, and that are supposed to be easy to use for anyone, no matter what's your level of interest or expertise. And before that, I'm gonna just like, maybe most of you know already this, but I wanna like explain like all the regular steps that an eviction has. And we can potentially get data from all of these places. Some are more difficult than others, but I think it's important to kind of like explain like the basics. So an eviction normally goes through or can potentially go through these 5 steps, right? First, the notice, when the landlord delivers the notice to quit to the tenant. Then the landlord has to go to the court and start the filing, and with that starts the eviction case in court. After that, there's a hearing where the judge hears the case, and then there's a court decision. The judge issues an eviction judgment, where that it's in favor of the landlord or the tenant. And finally, there's the process where a constable, sheriff, or whomever law enforcement officer is in charge of this goes to the unit and removes the tenant and the belongings if that's needed. Most of the data that it's easy to access is on the filing and in the hearing, and to some decision, I mean, on the filing, the court decision, and to some level in the enforcement. We focused a lot on the filing because, as you can imagine, the idea that we're trying to go for here is how to measure housing instability. And although there's going to be different kind of ways of each tenant, for example, might go all the way or might just leave at the start, we believe that the filing is very representative of what's happening across this whole process. So the first tool that we created after the lab was founded was this massive attempt to try to understand how many evictions were happening in the US. Camila, if you go to the next slide, please. So back then, we created the National Eviction Map, which is a massive attempt to have data for all of the country. Initially, it was from 2000 to 2016. You can access it in evictionlab.org/map. And now it has data from 2000 to 2018 for every county in the 50 states plus the DC area. So what we have here is the data for the eviction filing rates, total amount of evictions estimated, and also you can go deeper there and check for lots of like useful demographic data and characteristics on population. You can very easily compare state to state or county to county. And for example, here we just like clicked on 3 states, and you scroll down, and you're gonna automatically have this comparison, which shows, you know, how common evictions are in Florida, Texas, and California. And you can see something that it's very obvious now for us, but it wasn't back then, that where you live matters a lot. So there's a lot of factors that go into why some state might have a higher or lower eviction rate. than the other. But just so that you understand, the national averages are always around 7 to 8%. And you can see how in Texas, like those are a little bit higher. And in California, they are much, much lower in spite of how unaffordable this state is and was back then. Remember, this is for data from 2000 to 2018. And in this case, we're seeing data for 2018. So a lot has happened since then. With this data, we're able to understand like how there are places that are more impacted, for example, in Florida than in others. And in this case, we did a quick calculation to see what are the counties with the most eviction filings. In this case, we did it only with counties with more than 1,000 evictions filed, just like to take away like the ones where there might be like a lot of noise in terms of statistical noise, and also to kind of compare apples to apples. And you can see here that Duval County, so Jacksonville, is a little bit above the national averages. But then you have other places that are not the ones maybe that we would think about, like Bay County or St. Lucie County. I don't know how you pronounce it. Sorry if I butchered that one. But then obviously Broward is up there too. Now, we know that this was the data for 2018, and we know that evictions tend to be more common in cities, but if we look at smaller counties too, there's a couple like Putnam and Bradford County that also show up pretty high up in the rankings in Florida, at least for 2018. So when we finalized and created the national map, that was a big deal. Like for the first time, we had eviction data for all over the country. But then something happened. The pandemic came in 2020. And sadly, we realized that although that was like a huge, huge attempt of getting data transparency in terms of evictions, it wasn't enough. And we needed to have more uh, live, real-time kind of data. So we started checking like how easy was that to do and in what cities we could do it. And obviously doing it nationwide, it's very difficult. A lot of courts are super slow into reporting their data, or they report it with a lot of errors. But we were able to create this new data set called Eviction Tracking System, which has data live month by month and has had it since 2020 all the way to last month. And now we have around 10 states and more than 30 cities. Through this website, we've been able to kind of monitor what's happening in roughly around a third of all the renter households across the country. So as you can see here, like in those locations, there's been more than 1 million eviction filings in the last 12 months. And it's also been very useful to kind of compare how different housing markets are reacting to this post-pandemic kind of landscape of evictions too. So here we have the 6 cities or metro areas for which we have data for Florida. And as you can see, it varies a lot. Obviously, these are places that might be a little bit smaller, like Gainesville, where we have 1,700 eviction filings in the last, I believe that's 12 months, Camila. Yeah. And then we have other places where evictions seem to be much more common, both in terms of raw eviction filing counts, like Jacksonville, where we have more than 13,000, or Miami with a similar number. But I think something that is really important to notice is these two other columns that we have here. The filing rate, which gives amount of evictions for every 100 renter households. And in that situation, we've seen, remember that we just saw like the Jacksonville from back in 2018, which was around 8%. And now we see that those high numbers still remain. And then we have the filings relative to pre-COVID average. And we see, for example, that Gainesville, a place where evictions are relatively uncommon compared to other cities, but that they are much common now than before the pandemic. Something that is really important to remember is that data is still very difficult to capture and to keep getting, and we've had some trouble getting updated data for some cities in Florida. So you can see here, for example, that in Fort Lauderdale we haven't had data for a little while in Tampa and in Jacksonville we haven't had the problems that we've seen in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach. Camila, next slide, please. I really want to invite you to explore this data, both the national map and the eviction tracking system, because there's a lot more to dig in. So, for example, here we went inside one of the pages of, I believe this is all for Fort Lauderdale. I'm sorry, for St. Petersburg, Tampa, right? Yeah, and you can see that we have these very easy to read graphs for eviction filing numbers during the last month, but you can also trigger, click on the buttons and see for all the data since the start of the pandemic, and you can see it as filing counts or compared to pre-pandemic averages. We also have data for, in some cities, for who is evicting the most. So we have these eviction hotspots. And we know from this and from previous research that most landlords don't evict or evict very rarely, but there are some landlords that evict a lot. So in the case of the Tampa Bay area, we know that almost a quarter of all evictions that happen are being done by just 100 addresses, right? And you can see here the top 10 addresses. Maybe you will see some address that looks a little bit familiar. And if you want to give us some feedback on that, we would really appreciate it. By the way, for all of this, there's always a link that you can see here that says get the data. And if you're interested in downloading data, playing with spreadsheets, and reading this a little bit more differently, you can always download all the data that we have. You can always play with it. And if you have any questions about it, you can reach out to us. You will also be able to see maps. Sometimes these maps are by census tract, so super particular, very like specific, and sometimes they will be more like by zip code. We also have information about the disproportionate impact of eviction filings on Black renters and in some cases Latino renters. A lot of there's a similar impact, disproportionate impact in women renters. And then you will have these very useful summaries with like total amount of filings, eviction rates, and other information. Let's go to the next one. We finally, we're almost done with our presentation, but we wanted to give you kind of like an exclusive peek into some of the things that are coming up soon from the lab. So we are working on several projects, both in terms of papers and also just like in terms of short-term reports that we create too. And one of the reasons why we reach out to Jorge, and we would love like your input on this, is that we're working on a quick report to try to understand how quickly an eviction happens across the country. So what we are doing there is that with Camila, we've been reaching out to lawyers and people that work in legal aid throughout the country so that they can tell us how long in average and what are the minimum times for each step of an eviction process. And we want at some point to present that comparatively, because we know that evictions happen very quickly, but it would be really, really interesting to actually have a number and also understand how different that is throughout states, and how does this kind of relate to the lower or higher eviction filing rates that we see in different places. We are about to publish really soon something that it's going to be on a paper, a research paper about the impact of evictions on school students and their performance. So if you want to find out more about that, I really recommend you to follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter. We are everywhere, from Twitter to TikTok. Camila actually does a great job with our TikTok account. And we're very good at replying too in case you have questions. I'm personally working on a project to understand the impact of evictions for the immigrant community, and in particular with undocumented tenants. Um, Obviously, quantifying that impact is extremely difficult, as the data on undocumented tenants is very difficult to assess and to understand. So what I'm trying to do is to collect anonymous conversations with undocumented tenants that have been through an eviction or have been threatened with an eviction, no matter if that is happening now or 5 years ago, it doesn't matter. We want to kind of like hear their stories and try to understand how being an immigrant, being undocumented, and other factors related to their background might make their experience of an eviction a little bit different. So if you want to share contacts with me, I'm more than happy to hear you. Also, if you just want to tell me your experience, that's great to hear. And I really need like the help of anyone that can lend a hand so that we can understand better this issue. We're about to publish something soon on the describing the movement towards right to counsel for evictions. That's coming very, very soon. And again, following us on social media and subscribing to our newsletter are the best ways to understand to hear first about this. And we're currently working also in something coming very soon about evictions in mobile home parks, which I know it's a really important issue in Florida. Florida is one of the, I believe, top 2 states with the most mobile home parks. That's just a few things that we're working on now and that should be out there soon. Yeah, Camila, I just wanted to finish with a few ideas on how legal aid and Eviction Lab can work together. I mean, I hope that this presentation has already kind of sparked some ideas on your side, but obviously through our eviction tracking system, you can understand and monitor general trends and understand what's happening in your community. By the way, if your community is not reflected here and you think you have any ways of helping us add and add data for your community, we are very happy to chat. You notice that, for example, Orlando is not there, and it would be amazing to have like data on Orlando and like the surrounding areas. I think the data that we have, both the national map and especially the eviction tracking system, is really good to map and identify geographical areas in your city where you can focus like engagement attempts or providing any services if you want to do like a talk to explain people like their rights. This is a really good tool to figure out what neighborhoods need it the most. I think also we're very, very happy to connect you with research or public policy cases about what's happening here or there in different places across the country. We also, if you see something interesting being done in Florida, we would love to hear about it. We do a lot of media monitoring, so we mostly know who is who and who is doing what, you know. So yeah, if you want to connect us with that would be great if you see anything interesting. But also like, yeah, if you're like, I'm working on this, I want to know who else is doing this, please reach out to us. We also need your help constantly to understand the why behind eviction trends, right? It's our team is sociologists. They are amazing at what they do. But a lot of times we're really good at seeing the numbers, but not it's understanding why something is going up or down. It's not as easy. And we actually have done this work. For example, we did a blog post recently about what's going on in New York City, because New York City in spite of being super unaffordable, has managed to keep their eviction rates really low, especially after the pandemic. But we didn't know why. So we reached out to a bunch of legal aid experts, academics, renters, advocates, and we wrote a piece explaining that actually what has happened in New York City has been mostly because of good policies that they have not only like put in place, but they have perfected them and they have kept them over time. Finally, I wanted to kind of invite you, as I was saying, to help us bridge these gaps between, in terms of data accessibility, the legal process, and between the courts and research. So if you have any ways of helping us not have the problems that we've had in some places, that's great. Or if we want to add more cities. And the last thing is like, if you have any ideas of things that we can do in terms of research in the future, any questions that you think haven't been answered enough, we love to hear of them. Academia moves a little bit slow, but there's been some cases where we've heard things and then that a couple of years afterwards end up being a paper, and it kind of opens up a big space for debate and discussion and hopefully for public policy. That's mostly what we were going to talk about. Again, that's our email that both Camila and I see, and you can find us on all social media at Eviction Lab or something similar. And especially LinkedIn and Blue Sky have been like very interesting spaces lately to chat and to hear what people are saying. But yeah, this is like very like an open invitation for all of you to not just ask questions if you have any, but to collaborate in the future if you have any ideas.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I do have a few questions that I know are going to be to the benefit of the audience. I was poking around the eviction tracker earlier, particularly with looking at Jacksonville. And I noticed on top of the filing rates, there was also some data on serial evictions. Can you talk a little bit about serial evictions and that type of data?
Yeah, so you're gonna see that there's two things to talk about that. Well, first, the concept of serial evictions. This is something that maybe anecdotally you might already have seen, but as I was telling before, we know that most landlords rarely evict, but that some evict a lot. And we actually realized that this was happening and that this was very common in some places more than in others. In particular, in Jacksonville, there's more than a third of all the eviction filings come from just 100 buildings. And we have a paper. I don't know if Camila, if you can post the blog post for that, but that paper talks about like the patterns that we see on those serial evictors. And what we believe is behind this is that in some places where evicting is really easy, they end up using eviction as a rent collecting technique. And obviously that's very problematic because an eviction stays in someone's record, and that can have very negative consequences for their future housing possibilities. I believe also it can impact other kind of like credit scores and things like that. You will see not only this list of eviction hotspots that speaks about that, but we also have this serial filing rate, which is it basically says like the unique households filed, the share of eviction filings that are seen repeatedly at the same address within the last 2 years. And you can see that in some places that's pretty much, it's similar to the eviction filing rate, normal eviction filing rate, but in Jacksonville it's pretty high. It's twice that. So that means that a large percentage of the evictions filed are against the same tenants, or that they experience at least two in eviction filings in 2 years. Yeah, this, as I was saying, it's something that we see that seems to be related to how easy it is to file, and to specific landlords that they use this as a common behavior and a strategy at some level. Yeah.
We have a question that just dropped into the chat, so I'm going to read it out loud for the benefit of the audience. Will you develop information of where these families, individuals go after the eviction has been enforced?
This is a great idea, and it's something that we would love to find out more. We are slowly trying to understand that better. There is a way to do that, but it's incredibly difficult, which is through surveys, right? Like, because we don't have like that paper trail that we see with the filing afterwards. We have done this, though, in a couple of occasions with papers, with work that we have done, this collaborative work that has been done with the census, where we've been able to, match the filing with a household, and we've been able to see it over time. And that's what we got in the mortality paper that Camila spoke about, which talks about, how not just being filed against, but also just like paying a lot of money in terms of rent impacts your mortality in the long term. In the research that we're working on education, what we've been able to do is that we've been able to match the filings with some particular school data for a particular school district, and we've been able to see a little bit more of that way, the pathway. One area that we haven't explored yet, but I think in the next few years we should have some more information, is the pathway to homelessness, right? And that's really, really difficult. In my experience talking to people, what you see with people that experience homelessness is this is not a straightforward path from like an eviction to being unsheltered in the street. It's actually much more complex process where you might spend some days or months in the street, and then you go back to a car, and then you go back to someone's house and couch surf, and then maybe you manage to get some temporary place to live, and then so it's pretty complicated to talk about that. There's one really good paper that worked on that in California, but we hope that we can have more information about that at some point, but not soon. As I was saying, it's very, very difficult. Camila, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I think just in terms of understanding eviction judgment and really what happens after that filing, I think it's worth going back to this drum that we constantly bang of the lack of data availability. Unfortunately, it's really hard sometimes to just get eviction filings, and that's something that courts are really good at tracking. It gets even harder when it comes to enforcement, because often the courts aren't the ones tracking that information. That could be like sheriff's office, marshal, or whatever agency is actually carrying out those eviction orders. So yeah, I think Tracy mentioned in the chat, what she would love to know what happens after filings and how many evictions are actually enforced. And unfortunately, that information again really differs state to state, city to city. So we don't have that information, unfortunately, but that's why we really push for data transparency and hopefully some kind of national database from the federal government.
Yeah, I'm curious also if you hear anything from the tenants that you represented, but in the project, this one that I was telling you about, on undocumented tenants, I take a lot of time to chat with them about the impacts, and in some cases I've talked with tenants, which are the most interesting cases actually, that were evicted 5 years ago or more, and they can see very clearly the impact that it had, like long term. And one thing that I've heard from them, and in this case, it's undocumented tenants, but it's in many different states, states that are more immigrant friendly, states that aren't. In general, the situation that they describe is a situation of worse worst housing situation, and that means it's either paying more, living in worse housing conditions, something that's very common with our Latino immigrants is living in overcrowded situations to kind of being able to afford this new price point of rent. Yeah, or having to live farther away. So in any case, in any of those cases, and sometimes are those four combined, it's a worse housing situation. Yeah.
Now, kind of piggybacking on Tracy's question, because I know that's part of the challenge. That kind of goes back to that slide where you showed the notice, the eviction filing, with the hearing if it ever actually happens. That is extremely difficult to track. So, what can you talk a little bit about your success or best practices or some obstacles that you faced working with other courts, not only in Florida but across the nation, on what works when it comes to the ask? Like, I need this data. What do you usually look for? And how do you have success getting that data back?
It's a really good question. I think there's like we are not with Camila in the team that actually does that, but we obviously hear constantly from the conversations with the court. And I think when we've created successful and sustainable collaboration, that's what works the best. When we really create like a good relationship with them, um, when we have a partner, for example, a local partner, that's super, super helpful. And that local partner has worked with the courts both in like a personal level and like in terms of like also like maybe I don't know if teaching is the right word, but kind of like learning how they can also improve their data accessibility. Um, so yeah, so we have like some great partners. Like there's this data for good organization based in Texas called January Advisors that has helped us with the Texas data and a couple of other places. And I think what they've created is that. And they have created, they have scrapers, which work really well, but for that to exist, you have to already have, the input of data that it's like done in the right way and that it's consistent. Um, yeah, I do think that there's like a very important kind of like the courts also have to learn what they get from this, and so there's an important kind of like conversation there to have almost like at a personal level with policymakers and with people that work in courts to kind of like buy into why this is important, and I think that's where people like everyone that is in this conversation can have a real big impact. Yeah.
I think it's also worth noting that like sometimes courts recognize the importance of this data, but modernizing systems enough to get this data is expensive and time consuming. For example, in Illinois recently went through that process, and I think it was a process that happened over several years, where all their civil cases were just going under small claims, whether it was divorce or whether it was eviction, etc. And then, changing their system in order to detail what kind of case it was. I think for one county, it was like an investment of $50,000. And the court system had to completely change their record keeping manual. But I think thanks to our work, this is becoming a larger conversation across the country where courts are willing to put in the work and the money to get there. But again, federal investments would be the key.
Yeah, Camila is very humble, so she's not going to mention this, but she did a really interesting exercise when she went and asked for the same data kind of request to courts in all the 50 states to kind of gauge how easy it was. It was nothing out of the ordinary, something very simple. I believe that we asked for data for 3 years by month. and you can read here, you can read her experience here. She even mapped a little bit of like how easy it was in one state compared to another. Uh, um, and one thing that I would mention that it's interesting, because I know that it worked in Texas, and I don't know if it might work in Florida too, but kind of like saying like, this city has it, why don't we have it? Sometimes it's a good argument to kind of like softly press like your local authorities into being more data transparent too. So yeah.
And Juan, you mentioned local partners. This is kind of a great segue for a plug for a local resource that we have. A lot of people on this webinar probably know the Schimberg Center, and they know Anne Ray. This is a great local resource that we have. I dropped the links to the database, and on top of evictions and foreclosures, which is one of the challenges that Camila mentioned. Sometimes how are these identified? It is hard to identify which ones are which, whether it is residential or commercial or foreclosures. It can be hard to tell them apart. It's a great resource that we use in Florida. And just to do a quick plug for both, I was kind of nerding out and going through the Jacksonville one specifically, and I looked at those eviction hotspots. And out of the top 10 eviction filers, there were two that showed up on the Timber Center under subsidized housing. So they were number 6 and number 10 on that list. So that is really useful information, because if it's subsidized housing, it's very likely that the people that live there are eligible for legal aid. So it's a great way to use our limited resources and maximize our outreach efforts, right? We may be able to get involved with the people in that community and try to identify what's happening. Why are people being evicted there? Is it for non-payment? Can we identify resources to help with rental assistance, particularly in subsidized housing? Is there an issue with calculating, what the rent is, or depending on what the subsidy is? So it's just a great tool to kind of really look at and try to maximize our impact. So needed to drop that in there because I use Jimberg all the time. It's one of those hyperlinks that I have. And if you're serving a particular county, when you look at the Eviction Lab right now, I would probably say and part of the wish list, let's say we have in Orange County one day, having a hyperlink for Orange County for the Eviction Lab. I'm looking at all of those maps and having a bookmark for Schimberg, specifically for Orange County. All of that is possible. So it's a great way to use data to maximize our efforts.
Yeah, and not only for these data tools, but we rely a lot on partners like the Schimberg Center and a bunch more. Furman Center in New York. We talk constantly with similar like organizations, in Harvard or in California. There's a couple. So yeah, we really appreciate that. And LSC, it's like a really big source for us too. We have these particular cities probably because those are the ones that we can get the data month to month, and with the level of detail that we need. But obviously we're a national research center, so like a lot of times like the best answers will come from the local folks for sure. Yeah.
And I did, in the materials that I will be sharing, not only will we have the slides that Camila and Juan Pablo used today, but I also dropped a lot of the links specifically to the Eviction Lab website. You will find that on their website, they also have listed a lot of statewide and national resources that are really useful. And one of them is the LSC Eviction Tracker that Juan Pablo just mentioned. I think it's great to see what others are doing. Sometimes it's like, okay, I want that. Like, how do we get to that? And if rather than starting from scratch and reinventing the wheel, it's a great way to get that conversation started. So I don't know. Let me see if we have another. I think we have another question here. Is there a portion of the site that specifically covers the policies that exist in communities where evictions are lower? So that comparison can be made and easily digested for educational purposes? That's a great question.
It's a great idea, and we've thought about doing something like that. We sometimes have internally created documents like that, but they are not in the point needed to be shared. So right now it's a little bit more of a case by case. I also, yeah, I recommend, well, you can always reach out to us if there's a particular thing. The answer that we always give is like, what's the solution that we need is like, normally it's not just one, there's no silver bullet, magic wand kind of solution here. So there are many and they have to adapt to different kind of um, scenarios and what's happening in each state. And so for example, one thing that most people don't talk about, and I believe in Florida, you're not in such a bad situation with this, is filing fees. So we know that in some places filing fees can be incredibly as low as $15. And in other places they can be above $350. And we know that when you increase filing fees, eviction rates go down. And there's a case in one of the papers that we have, where, for example, we compare, I believe, Mississippi and Alabama, and those are like two very similar states in terms of, income and racial, demography and so on. But one of them has eviction rates much lower than the other, and we believe that it's mainly because it has higher eviction filing fees. But then there's like 1,000 other tools that we could use, and hopefully at some point we can put them out there. In the meantime, I believe the Housing Solutions Lab, I think it's called, at Furman Center, has a long list of things that, in terms of policy work, and we are from time to time, publishing papers about specific things and how they work, like the filing fees paper that I just mentioned, and this right to counsel paper that it's coming soon. But there's a wide range of tools that cities could put out, including mediation, right to counsel, rent assistance solutions. Like, for example, in New York, they have this thing called the one-shot deal that you can apply, I think, once every 2 years. That it's like not just for evictions and rent payments, but for a bunch of other things. And from that all the way to adding more affordable housing, which should be like the most important and long-term solution.
I think another really important resource that I found helpful when it comes to policy and case studies, just to see like what's happening in other places, not just on eviction, but housing affordability in general, I think is the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So we have a lot of great partners doing a lot of great things in this area.
I've actually been adding a lot of these links to one of the Google Docs that I'll be sharing with everybody. So I still don't have all of them, but I will keep adding all these great resources there so everybody can access these after the fact. And quick tip on these organizations, most of them have a newsletter that you can subscribe to. So make sure to subscribe to it. That way you will get ongoing updates as well. And speaking of the materials, I'm gonna drop the link here to the materials. We already have some of them in there. I'll be updating the materials folder with the Google Doc, and we already have the slides in there. I will also drop the CLE code, and I'm gonna read it out loud as well. For those that need the CLE credit, the CLE code is 2503257N, and I will drop it into the chat along with the materials. So let me also check that if we have any other pending questions before we wrap up. Let me drop it here. I also need to do a quick plug and big thank you to Mary Rose for connecting me with Camila. That's how it all started. Camila called me and we were discussing, the eviction process in Florida. So if you ever want to have those type of conversations, you probably want to reach out to Juan, Pablo, and Camila. I know it's great feedback for them. So here we see the newsletter. I do see Kim with the Martin with the hand raised. I can bring you off mute if you want to come off mute and ask a question. So let's see. Allowed to talk. So Kim, if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Not sure if this was on purpose, but. Okay, waiting for other questions. Well, we're almost at time, so I guess that this is a good time to wrap it up. I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. Another reminder, it's Fair Housing Month, right? April is Fair Housing Month, so when you look at data, this is an extremely important topic. So I want to thank both Juan Pablo and Camila for joining us here today and presenting on this very important topic and, helping out the Florida legal aid and public interest law community. So with all that said, thank you again, Juan Pablo and Camila. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.